This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
All right, welcome into another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you as today we resume our Inside Rhode Island Cannabis series with a look at the history of cannabis as medicine. Now, this is a really fascinating conversation, a lot of detail orientation going all the way back into like thousands of years ago and examining, again, the history of cannabis as medicine all the way up through today. And, of course, crossing through the various phases of prohibition. Now, this conversation comes at a time when recreational legalization here in Rhode Island is certainly fast approaching. We record this episode on the morning of several committee hearings inside of the Senate and House here in Rhode Island, which are going to basically determine the pathway for recreational legalization here in Rhode Island. So we'll continue to follow up on that, obviously. In fact, pretty soon we're going to have the sponsors of the recreational legalization bills here on Bartholomew Town. But again, for today, fascinating stuff. Welcoming back Doctors Jason Iannuccilli and Jonathan Martin, who break this down in a digestible but extremely thorough conversation. So hopefully you enjoy it. As always, if you have any questions at all, feel free to email me, bill@ripodcast.com. And if you have any questions on cannabis, also bill@ripodcast.com. I'm going to present your questions to the doctors during the course of this series, which will be a monthly feature here on Bartholomew Town. It has been a monthly feature throughout the course of Season 5 here in 2022. So again, if you have a question, send me an email, and we'll start to include that into the various conversations that we're having here on Inside Rhode Island Cannabis. Do you know what's in your cannabis? Recreational use legalization is on the horizon, and consumer health is PureVita Lab's priority. If you use cannabis, choose lab-tested legal cannabis products over unlabeled black market products, which are likely to contain harmful contaminants. Legal products offer a safe and controlled cannabis experience. Competent testing labs are the gatekeepers to the legal cannabis industry. PureVita Labs, founded by physicians and PhD chemists, is rooted in science and built on integrity. They are committed to helping cultivators and product manufacturers deliver clean and accurately labeled cannabis products to consumers. Know what's in your cannabis, know your dose, control your experience, and visit PureVitaLabs.com. That's PureVitalabs.com. All right, so welcome back into Inside Rhode Island Cannabis here on the Bartholomew Town Podcast. And this has been a series that has received a lot of interest, a lot of feedback from many of you. And I know that it's something that is certainly undercovered. A lot of people talk about the cannabis culture and things of that sort. And then, of course, even the business side of things. But what about the actual meat and potatoes of it, so to speak, which is the analytical testing and the science behind cannabis. And today we're going to discuss something that is a fascinating topic for anybody, really. That is, to me anyway, the history of cannabis as medicine. So we've covered the importance of laboratory testing for consumer safety and information about likely product effects, the dangers of buying untested cannabis on the black market, and THC potency, which is something that is kind of the dominant way that cannabis is marketed in terms of Rhode Island, inside of medical dispensaries, and broadly speaking, in the recreational market, in general, that is kind of how it's put forth. Like, hey, this has got 30% THC, so therefore it's the best cannabis you can purchase. That's, in reality, that cheats the consumers for a financial gain. But today we're going to kind of take a step back and back to the beginning of the conversation on cannabis and bring all of you up to speed on the key arguments that are made in the medical marijuana controversy and issues surrounding legalization. So we have Dr. Iannuccilli and Martin here with us as always. And gentlemen, a pleasure to resume our conversations. Let's get right into this. So let's talk about, anybody born after 1960 and have only known marijuana to be an illegal recreational drug. There's a lot of confusion about the wave of legalization efforts that are taking place in multiple countries around the globe. Why this sudden revival of interest and acceptability in cannabis as a medicine or even as an acceptable form of recreational self-medication?
Yeah, so I think that there's been so much dogma and indoctrination over the last close to 100 years about cannabis the United States, we've been distracted by multiple wars during this time, and it's taken the focus off of this product for a good deal of time. But if you go back, there's a couple reasons I think now that this sort of state by state domino effect is occurring. And one of them is that we're finally starting to get some scientific research about this drug, right? Cannabis in general. And that's been occurring because state by state, within those confines, you're able to do some research. And it's not federally funded research, but it's like really, highly focused academic research within those states that have legalized cannabis markets. And every time we look at it, it's positive news. It's good information. It's really amazing, fascinating information that, we haven't known, we've never known. And so that I think is pushing the acceptability of it, along with just the momentum of legalizing it state by state by state. And so I think that's pushing it forward. But if you go back, it wasn't always like this, right? We're trying to break out of the idea that cannabis in general is this, is a dangerous thing, is a gateway drug, is something that should be avoided at all costs. And we're moving away from that. And we're, trying to push it toward the idea that, well, it's actually potentially really medicinal, right? Really has therapeutic benefits, can be used as a recreational, relaxational sort of compound, just like alcohol. We've had these ideas in the past. We've used this in the past, going back as far as almost 3,000 years BC. Chinese medicine was using cannabis 3 millennia before Christ. And we've got a wealth of information that can tell us that even toward the 2nd century, Egyptians were using cannabis for multiple issues, including some that we use it for today, glaucoma. They used it for GI ailments. We've got Zoroaster, who the father of Zoroastrianism, which is the father of really, I suppose, the Abrahamic religions and monotheism. I mean, this is a basis of philosophy for the Western civilization. Had actually listed in his compendium cannabis being the number one most important medicinal plant of the 10,000 medicinal plants that he was aware of. I mean, this is a big deal. This is going back, again, 700 years before Christ. And then the Greeks and the Romans used it. I mean, they used it for treating multiple conditions. So, I mean, this stuff has been used appropriately. It's been accepted by societies in the past. It's only in the past 100 years that we have really put the kibosh on it and have sort of really stunted our growth here. Even in the 19th century in the United States, prior to Prohibition, cannabis was widely used. You could pick it up at the pharmacies. It was used for menstrual cramps. It was used for headaches. It was used for earaches. It was actually given to Queen Victoria in the 19th century for her menstrual cramps. In the mid 19th century, it was actually added to the United States Pharmacopoeia, later to be removed, of course. And then we've got medical journals, The Lancet, which is still around today. In 1890, it published an article outlining the usefulness of using cannabis for opiate withdrawal, which we now know is actually very helpful. And we've got an opioid epidemic, obviously, after since the 1990s in the U.S. And it's just now becoming apparent that cannabis may actually be able to be used safely for those people who are stuck in that situation.
Yeah, that's really, really, really fascinating stuff. And it seems like cannabis was initially, going way back, widely accepted and used as an over-the-counter and a prescription type of medication by physicians and the general public, basically up until the turn of the 20th century. So what happened? Why did people's minds change on this? And the acceptability of cannabis pivoted from this, quite frankly, highly touted, prestigious type of medicine to what it is in some ways still known as today, and sort of some people view it as like a narcotic almost.
Yeah, I mean, the ugly truth here is that, around the beginning of the 20th century, prohibitionist attitudes against all intoxicants really started gaining momentum. And it was largely due to racism and xenophobia. Quite honestly, the period of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939 really amplified this. There was a close to 30% unemployment rate and a lot of anti-immigration sentiment because of that. So this prohibition era really kind of gave rise to a lot of anti-cannabis propaganda, which, we're going to take a deeper dive into here. But looking at that time period, we start to realize that we've essentially been programmed to react with fear to cannabis as a substance. If you look back, one of the earliest documented, sort of legislative acts in 1914 in El Paso, Texas, there was a local ordinance that it banned the sale or possession of marijuana for racial reasons. Marijuana was associated with Mexican immigrants. Quote, at the time, it was associated with Negroes, prostitutes, pimps, and criminal class of whites. So, all of that negativity in that association, there was this fear that this vice would spread to the white school children and corrupt them. This was sort of the messaging that was going on back then. So there was actually a local ordinance in Texas that banned it. Alcohol prohibition, that ended in 1933, but cannabis prohibition endured. And when you look and you ask that question, why, it's pretty interesting. The propaganda that really was spread by lobbyist type efforts on behalf of special interest groups at that time, who stood to lose millions of dollars if cannabis was maintained as a legal substance, that was very, very effective at the time. Fully understanding the context of the discussion really starts with understanding the fundamental difference between marijuana and hemp. They are both considered cannabis, but to put it quite simply, hemp, by definition, is cannabis that contains no more than 0.3% THC. So it's essentially non-psychoactive, and cannabis is a weed, so this stuff was essentially an agricultural staple. Hemp at the time and still has over 50,000 uses that span most industries in the economy, including food, energy, textiles, medicine, and paper. So because it's a weed, it's really cheap to grow. And its simple existence, threatened and still threatens the economics of multiple competing industries. So we look back at like the 1930s. A lot of special interest groups at that time from some of those competing industries lobbied hard to keep cannabis and all this anti-marijuana sentiment in the forefront. And that includes marijuana and hemp. They actually really hinged on focusing on the psychoactive properties of marijuana, which contains a higher amount of THC, as justification that all cannabis, should be banned as this sort of intoxicating substance that was associated with all of these evils in society. We do know that there were a couple of key players that were involved in those efforts. And it's very interesting to see, the rationale behind why they did this. But, you look at William Randolph Hearst. He was a media magnate, back then, who really used his control over written media platforms to proliferate these quote unquote news stories depicting marijuana as this killer drug that threatened white America. He owned 28 newspapers. And in those newspapers, he reported horror stories of minorities committing rape and murder and all these heinous acts while under the influence of cannabis. And, there's if you look into the history of this, you can actually see screenshots of the actual newspaper headlines that read, one of them reads, "Murder weed found up and down coast, deadly marijuana dope plant ready for harvest that makes enslavement of California children possible." Fake news, right? Does this sound familiar? His rationale for doing this, he and his banker, Andrew Mellon, had a large stake in the Canadian lumber industry. And the wood pulp that was sort of a byproduct of that lumber industry was used to make paper, which Hearst used to print his newspapers on. So that paper was also sold for additional profit. And because hemp was also used to make paper, and it was actually used in it was a cheaper process to produce it, hemp actually threatened the profits from his wood pulp paper industry. So, again, he used his newspapers to propagate all of this stuff to try to sort of get people to say, yeah, we should not have cannabis, at all in society, and preserve the integrity of the wood pulp paper industry. An interesting fact, drafts of the Declaration of Independence were actually written on hemp paper. Wow. A lot of people don't know that. But again, back to these influential individuals, the DuPont family. Everyone knows DuPont. They were giants in the chemical and synthetic textile industry. They also lobbied hard for cannabis prohibition. Why? Well, they had a revolutionary new product, synthetic nylon. It was produced from plastics. And back then, nylon initially was produced from the fiber in hemp plants. So because Andrew Mellon was also invested in this venture, and as you can see, I mean, there are a number of reasons why they would want cannabis to be prohibited. Downstream, there were other competing industries that sort of later lobbied to keep cannabis, on the list of banned substances. Tobacco companies, they raised and donated millions of dollars to police and law enforcement, and actually to be used in the war on drugs to eradicate cannabis and other drugs from society. The prison system benefited financially by being filled with a steady influx of nonviolent marijuana offenders. You can imagine racial profiling was rampant in law enforcement. And that's actually the crux of the argument now for all the social equity clauses that are being brought into cannabis legislation. People of color were disproportionately targeted and punished for possession and use of cannabis. It's a fact. The alcohol industry later lobbied against cannabis and probably still does today due to the competitive revenue share of what do you do at 5, 6 o'clock when you want to unwind after a long workday? And, actually, if you look at the data, there's a recent study from the American Addiction Centers that revealed that Americans actually prefer cannabis to alcohol by a margin of 57 to 43%. So we're seeing a huge shift here, and that threatens a lot of industries. Pharmaceutical companies, they once produced cannabis tinctures widely as home remedies. They were available. But the invention of the pill really revealed a cheaper economy of scale. Now they could mix chemicals together in a predictable sort of yield. They could produce a final product that could be measured out and dosed more accurately than a plant-based botanical medicine. So for them, the overhead costs of production were much cheaper with synthetic pharmaceuticals. So they said, you know what? Yeah, we don't need cannabis tinctures anymore. It kind of threatens the sale of other pharmaceuticals that we're producing. Another interesting fact, prescription drug use has decreased by over $162 million per year in the states that have actually legalized cannabis. Wow. Opioid overdose deaths, which has been a huge problem, the data shows that they've decreased in those states by about 25%. So all with cannabis legalization. So again, I mean, what's going on here? There are a lot of pieces of evidence that are sort of coming into play here that are leading to people questioning why it is that cannabis was actually banned in the first place and whether or not it should continue to be banned. I'll give you one more example. I mean, this anti-cannabis propaganda that really flooded the American conscience. There was an infamous film back in 1936 that was created. It was called Reefer Madness. It was sort of this satirical, melodramatic type film that depicted high school students that were sort of lured by drug pushers to try marijuana. And that sort of triggered this series of sort of, mishaps and events that started with a hit and run accident, then manslaughter, suicide, attempted rape, hallucination. It was like just this really wild plot. And that movie actually, it hit home with a lot of people for the wrong reasons. But again, this messaging continued. It was all the after school specials and everything, the public service announcements that continued, and I remember these too from when I was in school. You'd go home, you'd turn on the TV and watch some cartoons, and, there'd be a commercial with, a girl who's, looks like she's smoking a cigarette, it's a joint, and her dog starts talking to her, Sally, I really don't like it when you smoke weed. It's like this stuff, everyone remembers this. But again, that is sort of a lot of that background on how this sentiment sort of came about. And we've sort of been programmed to think about cannabis in that way.
And once you have this package, if you will, of anti-cannabis propaganda that's really driven by, on a baseline level, corporate interests and xenophobia and racism and all of these sorts of things, well, it translates into legislative action for cannabis prohibition written into law. So how did that all come about?
Yeah, it's interesting to see that, I'd love to know who paid for and produced Reefer Madness.
Yeah.
Because, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of that money to produce that film came from large corporations that were threatened by cannabis. And just as Jay has pointed out, so many titans of industry had a reason to not want cannabis use by citizens. And the year after Reefer Madness gets released, the United States decides to enact the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which this should go and remind us, because I think we see it in cycles. Federal, governmental messaging can be influenced by corporate interests, and the legislative acts that come about because of these, corporate interests for profits can really change the momentum of something where, you can hamstring progress, and you can hamstring certain industries from taking off. And I think that's what we saw with the 1937 Tax Act. It was over-regulation of cannabis, right? Cannabis had been legal, had been used as medicine, used as fibers, used for all sorts of products. And then all of a sudden it was so hyper-regulated that even the companies that are producing it for fiber, right? Not for the buds and for intoxicating use, but for paper, stopped creating it because they were overburdened by the taxation and the regulatory framework that they needed to follow. And so a lot of these companies started to shut down and get out of the cannabis industry. And so that essentially hamstrung all, cannabis producers. And then a few years after that, you start to see all these PSAs come out and the public service announcements in the 1940s, and they go all the way up until the 1990s, 2000s. Even today, you'll still see some, telling people that it's a dangerous drug, stay away from it, with really no evidence behind that messaging. In 1941, after about 91 years of being on the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is this compendium list of acceptable medications, it's removed. Right. So this is still on the heels of all this propaganda in the 1930s. And we're also coming into some world conflict here. There's some anecdotal conversations with people who cannabis can produce pacifists. We don't need pacifists going into World War II. But they remove cannabis from the pharmacopoeia. And at the same time, we start to see pressed tablets and pills becoming more popular. And the issue with cannabis as a medicine, it's still an issue now that we're working through, but we're at least working through it in an accelerated fashion now. It's difficult to dose it. We didn't understand what the active compounds were, right? At least Bayer understood that the active compound in the birch bark was acetylsalicylic acid, otherwise known as aspirin. They isolated that compound and were able to dose that compound in pressed tablet form, right? That makes things a lot easier when you can actually produce a milligram of an active ingredient. Well, cannabis is too complex, or it certainly was too complex back then to figure out what the active ingredient was and to dose it properly. So this becomes, part of the reason why I think there wasn't a lot of pushback, because it was mysterious. And when you were using cannabis in its oral form, in tinctures, the dosing was difficult to understand. They didn't know the active compounds, and the onset was unpredictable. Could be 45 minutes, could be 2.5 hours. Didn't matter. It's much less predictable than the other medications that the large pharmaceutical companies were working with. Then, you go a couple more decades, which I think we all know at our age now, they tend to fly by. And 1970 rolls along, and we get this Controlled Substances Act, which is sort of a further refinement of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and decides to classify certain drugs based on whether they have medical uses and whether or not they've got medical uses and they're intoxicating and potentially addictive and potentially dangerous. And the Schedule 1 is the list of medications that have zero acceptable medical uses. And therefore, you're not going to be able to get federal money to study them. You can't own them. You can't handle them. You can't distribute them. So this really sort of ended even the idea that we were going to come back toward cannabis and try and study it. Once it got on the Controlled Substances Act, it was the death knell for cannabis at that time. So, according to the federal government at that time, it had a high potential for abuse. Never been proven, actually. Not a single true, study that's actually shown a really high addictive property of cannabis. No accepted medical use, which you had almost 4,000 years of medical literature that had shown the medical use of cannabis was important. They put it alongside things like heroin, LSD, cocaine, things that were really just were proven to have high addiction potential and certainly a danger.
It could cause death.
And that characterization, is what is so odd about this moment right here, because now we're in this period where there's a massive legalization movement, despite the fact that the federal government still considers marijuana to be illegal under the Controlled Substances Act. So why is it that attitudes have changed towards cannabis? And do we know more about its effects now than we did back in, let's say, 1970?
So the short answer is yes, we absolutely do. As John pointed out earlier, this sort of period of scientific discovery has really shifted everyone's thinking. And quite honestly, I mean, this is recent. This is like, when I was in medical school, I don't know, was it 20 something years ago, we didn't really learn anything about the endocannabinoid system. And it's partially because, it was only recently discovered, but also that, there was still this sort of like, mental framework of cannabis being taboo. And like, look, why teach medical students and future doctors about a system that can only be influenced by a substance that is, deemed illegal. So, we look at this scientific revolution. It all really started recently, back in 1964. At that point in time, remember, up until then, we had no idea what was in cannabis, what was in marijuana that caused the effects that people were experiencing, the therapeutic benefits, as well as the psychoactive effects. The two most prevalent compounds in cannabis, THC and CBD, were finally isolated and identified in 1964 by a gentleman by the name of Raphael Mechoulam and one of his colleagues. They were PhD chemists at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. They really took it upon themselves to investigate cannabis to the extreme, in their lab. Now, this wasn't human subjects research, but this was like looking at the plant, looking at the chemistry and trying to identify the compounds that were responsible for the effects. So he and his team of scientists have since become the world's authorities on cannabis chemistry. They've published over 400 papers. They've, written several edited books. He himself owns 25 patents, and he's received 27 honors from 6 different countries for his work. So this is legitimate research. This guy has learned a lot about cannabis and has actually bestowed that knowledge on the industry. And this started that scientific revolution. So remember, until the discovery of THC, the main component of cannabis that causes its psychoactive effects wasn't known. It was poorly understood. So when you're talking about using cannabis, if you don't know how much of the psychoactive ingredient that is responsible for the effects is in the product that you're using, how can you ever control that experience? And that is really what led to the stigma of cannabis being this very recreational, uncontrolled sort of experience. It's very easy to overshoot and get too stoned. And people say, wow, that guy's in his own world. He's spaced out. Like, I don't want to be like that, And that's how the stigma sort of propagated. But now that we know what these ingredients are and we can identify them, now we have the ability to actually dose. And you start getting into more formulations where, you're now dealing with extracts, where you're taking the plant matter out and you're really, concentrating this stuff in a more even homogeneous type mixture that could be measured out for dosing purposes. We're getting to be more like the pills that the pharmaceutical industry started producing as a more acceptable form of medication. So anyway, that 1964 discovery is really what triggered all of this. But at the time, we still didn't know very much about how cannabis or THC for that matter interacted with the human body to actually cause the psychoactive effects. It wasn't until 1988 that we actually started to understand that. And that was an American chemist, Alan Howard. He located a large group of receptors in the brain that actually are triggered by and respond to THC. So as an aside, I know that some of the listeners are not scientists here. When you think of a molecule and a receptor, a molecule binds to a receptor in sort of a lock and key type mechanism. Receptors are the lock. The molecule is the key that fits in the lock and turns it to be able to cause an effect downstream. So finding these receptors in the brain was key. Now we know why the brain, we have these psychoactive effects because THC is introduced into the bloodstream. These receptors were actually found in areas of the brain that control emotion, memory, pain, pleasure, and reproductive drive. So, interestingly, we now know that there are no receptors in the areas of the brainstem that are responsible for controlling breathing. And that's not the case with opioids, pain medications. Those receptors are found in the breathing control regions of the brainstem. And that's the reason why, you can actually overdose on opioids and stop breathing and die. But the fact that these cannabis or THC receptors are not found in that area of the brain, that is, another reason why there's never been a reported overdose death related to cannabis. So why was this discovery of these receptors really interesting? Well, if you think about it, common sense, scientists knew that the brain wouldn't just manufacture these receptors that only responded to a molecule that was produced by the cannabis plant. So they speculated that there must be a natural substance produced by the body that acts on those receptors to cause these effects in sort of a smaller, minor degree. It's not a new concept. Pain medications, opioids, they act on the same receptors that our natural endorphins act on to control pain. So again, this is it's a scientific concept that exists, but this sort of discovery led to further investigation. And in 1992, sure enough, McCallum discovered the first endocannabinoid. In endo meaning that it's produced by the body naturally, as opposed to a phytocannabinoid, which is produced by the plant. That endocannabinoid, anandamide, which is sort of the natural form of THC, is produced in very low quantities in the human body. It wasn't shortly after there, rather, that the CBD, equivalent, this 2-arachidonoglycerol, which otherwise, 2-AG, if you want the technical term, that was discovered shortly thereafter. So we know that the body now produces molecules that are almost identical to THC and CBD that are found in the cannabis plant. Anandamide is now known to actually perform several functions in the body. It intensifies sensory experiences, it improves focus, it stimulates appetite, it temporarily blocks short-term memory. It can also create feelings of pleasure. It's produced on demand and released by cells in the body that, in response to extreme stress. So we've got this system now, as further research has identified, you've got receptors in various organs and tissues of the body that respond to these chemicals as a sort of measure to regulate stress, to keep the body in balance. What we call now scientifically a state of homeostasis. And anyone that's experienced the runner's high after a period of intense activity has felt the effects of the endocannabinoid system. That calming, focused, relaxed, uplifted mood, that heightened sensory experience, that is the endocannabinoid system at work right there. So again, a lot of scientific discovery here, but we are now in a world where we understand more about the nuts and bolts of how these products work. So that is why we are in a position now where we're really starting to question whether or not we should be, wiping cannabis off the face of the planet.
Yeah. This is Inside Cannabis, presented by PureVita Labs. Visit purevitalabs.com to learn more about why analytical testing is critical to this broad concept of moving forward with cannabis in the general public and for any version of legalization, whether inside of medical context or inside of recreational context. It's extremely interesting that the natural system within our bodies was only recently discovered, this natural system. Now that the science behind cannabis, if you will, is being revealed, should we expect that cannabis and plant-based medicines in general will garner more respect in medical practice outside of the quote-unquote alternative medicine space?
Yeah, so I think we're already seeing that. As a practicing physician, I see my patients already sort of over the past 10 years moving toward more engagement with nutraceuticals and the supplement industry. a lot of plant-based alternatives to pharmaceuticals. So I view that as generally a good thing, provided that there is some research behind this stuff, and the plants have been processed in an appropriate manner. They've been tested appropriately for lack of contaminants and et cetera. But I think it's going to be a while until you really start to see true acceptance in the medical realm of these plant-based medicines that have multiple compounds in them, to be put on par with these single compound pharmaceuticals that are mass produced and sold by big pharma. But I do think we're moving that direction. The endocannabinoid system that Jay was talking about, where we've got this slew of receptors that control so many of the physiologic functions, as well as some of the psychological states that we experience. Now that that's been elucidated and we know what the receptors are, we know the molecules that bind them both naturally and the phytocannabinoids and other things, the terpenes that actually bind to these receptors as well. We're starting to move toward an understanding of where we need to be with this. And that comes down to consistency, homogeneous products, knowing exactly what the concentrations of the active ingredients are in those products. And that's going to move toward people being able to, without fear, try and use cannabis products without, winding up with the negative effects that so many people have experienced or fear to experience, the rapid heart rates, the anxiety, sometimes the paranoia, the dry eyes and the dry mouth, and these other sort of negative effects that people associate with it. We're going to be able to control that very quickly with the understanding of the science behind cannabis. We talked about the prohibition of cannabis, but it is interesting throughout that time, since 1937, the Tax Act, and moving even after it was taken off the pharmacopoeia, there were some reports in the U.S. that sort of tried to shine a light on the potential positive uses for cannabis. The first being Governor LaGuardia's commission, 1944, had asked the question about, look into this and find out if cannabis is truly physically addictive, give us a report on this. And turned out that LaGuardia's report, his conclusion was there is no physical addiction associated with cannabis use. In fact, that someone can use it for a period of time, not use it for a period of time, not have any ill effects, not have withdrawal. And so, this is 1944 that this was released. 1972, there was actually a commission that was put together by President Nixon at the time to look into this. It was called the Schaefer Commission, which looked into cannabis and asked for some policy recommendations about how they should handle it, having been on the Schedule I list now. And they did 50 separate research projects in that commission. And they looked into, what were the effects and what were the sort of conclusions that could be drawn. And they ultimately decided that it should be decriminalized, 1972, right? That it doesn't have the public health problems that had been stigmatized with it for so long. And the public fear that was there was unproductive and certainly not upheld by the science that they were looking at. President Nixon got that report, decided it didn't go along with his current thinking, and decided to ignore the report. 1974, Congress decides to enact the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is going to be the only federally commissioned entity that can actually have responsibility for growing cannabis and using it for research. And that sort of got rid of all those other reports that sort of tried to shine a light on cannabis's positive attributes. And that, to this day, is the only commission, the only entity that's allowed to federally grow cannabis and use it for research. And unfortunately, their research has been poor.
Yeah, that's why the expansion of opportunity for scientific engagement is so critical. But with this state-based legalization process taking hold, how did we get to where we are now, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, it all started really back in 1996 in California. Voters passed Proposition 215, which made California the first state to legalize cannabis for medicinal use. Now, there were conditions. You had to have a doctor's recommendation, and you had to be registered as a patient with the state with a state-issued medical marijuana card, similar to the way that a lot of medical marijuana programs work today. But in 1996, that was a big, big step in the direction of acknowledging, hey, we think there's enough evidence out there to support use of this substance for a variety of different qualified diagnoses. Eventually, and again, this was all in contrast to what the feds were saying was appropriate. So this eventually started this domino effect of legalization across other states. So California led the way, and others followed. In 1998, we saw Alaska, Oregon, Washington. They jumped on board. 2000, it was Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada. I mean, really, all of this, it started like a rapid succession of people legalizing, or states legalizing for medicinal use. The first recreational legalization took place in 2012, which again was just right around the corner. That was in Colorado. Colorado and Washington in that year, they started legalizing adult recreational use, 21 plus. And again, I mean, we've seen several factors here that have come into play. I do think that the financial crisis of COVID recently and having to replete a lot of that stimulus money that went out. I mean, look, you can't just raise income taxes and property taxes on everybody and expect for them to pay back all of the stimulus money that went out. So, looking at the historic performance of marijuana tax revenue, like even in the state of Colorado, I mean, we're talking, hundreds of millions of dollars here. Like this is really a huge pot of gold here that was almost pulled out of thin air. So states are looking at that and they're saying, wow, this is a great way to replete a lot of the money that we've had to dole out from the Treasury. So again, I think that has had an impact. And I think it's really that with the science has really sort of caused this, cascade of rapid legalization over the course of the last couple of years. But I will say, though, that there have been indications from the federal government. It's almost like a tail between the legs sort of thing, where they haven't really decriminalized, they haven't delisted marijuana as a Schedule 1, but there are several acts and legislative sort of measures that have been put in place that have acknowledged the rights of states to sort of manage their own legal cannabis markets. So in 2013, the Cole Memo was issued, and that basically provided assurance to states that the Department of Justice wouldn't interfere with state legal operations. It would still prosecute state legal marijuana businesses if they violated federal priorities. And these are things that are kind of like common sense, like you can't traffic other illicit substances through your legal operation. You can't use any violence or firearms in commerce. You can't possess or use marijuana on any federally owned property. So again, I mean, and again, that whole thing, like no distributing to minors, like you can still get in trouble as a legal entity. You have to follow the rules. But essentially the Cole Memo was like, look, we won't interfere as long as you are following our rules and following the rules of your state. In 2013, there's the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment. This was a bipartisan piece of legislation that essentially prevents the Department of Justice from using any federal funds to interfere with the state's ability to implement their own laws regarding cannabis use and commerce. I mean, that's big. That's like, hey, by the way, you can't spend any money on enforcing, anti-cannabis laws if states are operating within the boundaries of their own legal structure. Another important thing that happened in 2018 under President Trump was the signing into law of the Farm Bill. What that did was, for the first time, it actually distinguished between industrial hemp and marijuana. And again, hemp is a form of cannabis that can't contain any more than 0.3% THC. It's non-psychoactive. It has a lot of uses in industry. Not only that, but it also is the main plant source for deriving CBD extracts for a lot of the CBD products that are now widely available and legal in almost every state. So hemp has been removed from the Schedule 1 classification. It's a step in the right direction. especially for, all that whole segment of the economy that was sort of punished for growing a cheap industrial staple and using it constructively for, the benefit of society. So again, I mean, I think that, we've started to see now with these restrictions being loosened by the federal government, people are actually more confident in legalizing. There's less concern that, there's going to be some downstream penalty for doing so. And right now, there are 37 states that have legalized cannabis for medicinal use and have their own medical marijuana programs. 18 states have legalized for adult recreational use. I mean, this is a tidal wave. It's not going away. And again, I mean, I didn't know much about the science behind cannabis until I started diving into it about 6-7 years ago. And I think that this is totally justified, especially when you compare cannabis to alcohol. So anyway, like looking at Rhode Island, where are we now in Rhode Island? Well, I mean, just a little bit of history. I mean, Rhode Island, medical marijuana use has been legal on a physician's recommendation and with a medical marijuana card since 2013, effectively. Currently, we have a bill that is, I believe it's going to vote today.
It is
a revised bill for adult use recreational legalization. And, again, I mean, you look at this recent public poll that was issued by the Senate, Rhode Island public is just overwhelmingly in favor of recreational legalization. 94.7% of respondents to the survey said we should legalize marijuana for adult use, 21 plus.
And it's important to note that, as we come into this, the businesses that cultivate, dispense, even the laboratories to some extent, these businesses are still hyper regulated, and they're regulated by both state laws, which, in many states are friendly, but also the federal laws, which for the most part, besides hemp, are still very unfriendly. And that's made, the cannabis industry pretty risky for people to get into. And they're simply not treated like other normal, totally legal, federally legal businesses. And as a business owner, I can tell you, your business can't operate in a vacuum, right? You need other vendors. You need to deal with the government, state and federal. And so it's been very difficult for a lot of these companies, a lot of these cannabis companies to sort of operate. I mean, there's no access to traditional banking, right? I mean, you hear some stories of these guys on the forefront back in 2014 who were setting up these compassion centers for medical marijuana, and they had to accept cash only. They had nowhere to put the cash. Right? You've got people that are they're putting it in safes, putting it under their bed. God knows where they were putting it, but they had no access to traditional banks. They couldn't get loans. They couldn't get business loans. There was no bankruptcy protection if the business went under. There was no bankruptcy protection for the business. They had tremendously high insurance premiums for just the physical plants that they were operating out of. They had the taxation for cannabis businesses was onerous. There was no deduction for normal operating expenses, which again, any business owner will tell you is could potentially put your business out of in the ground within a month or so. And we've got issues with landlords who are obviously have to operate under a lot of federal laws. So zoning was an issue. You had host community agreements that led to a lot of where was it? Central Falls, I think, where the mayor was trying to get bribes for issuing these host community agreements. We've got a lot of potential for pay to play sort of stuff within these states. The licensing fees, the amount of, the requirements to start a cannabis business, some of them had to have $500,000 or $1 million in cash on hand for operating expenses to even be allowed to pass through the amount of money. I think it was a $50,000 licensing fee. And I'm not 100% positive, but I think it was $50,000 licensing fee for a dispensary in Rhode Island. I mean, think about
some states, it's even higher. Like, I'm talking like $100,000+ just for an annual licensing fee.
Imagine if we were trying to open up a coffee shop, a cafe, and the state was like, okay, you can open up a coffee shop. It's going to cost you $100,000 to get started. I mean, it's
to get a piece of paper.
It's really
that's your margin of profit potentially if you're an early business, early stage startup. Small business.
Absolutely. It's all burn in the cannabis industry, and especially like, you look at the Rhode Island market, that's where we still are. It's a small medicinal patient market here. There's only so much revenue to go around. There are a lot of licenses out there. There are a lot of cultivators that put their heart and soul and life savings and to get it started up. And we haven't yet seen the return on investment there. So people think that people are making, money hand over fist in cannabis, and it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifice. And that's why, when you start looking at the bill and these moratoriums that are placed on new licenses, it's only fair to the industry to let, the existing infrastructure try to succeed with additional revenue where they can actually start building their business and growing it and doing everything the right way, affording the cost of the additional testing that should be performed to make sure these products are safe. Ensuring that manufacturing processes are somewhat standardized so people can rely on a product experience and go back and get that same experience the next time around. Yeah. This is really where the industry needs to go. And if we keep flooding the market with additional licenses because it's easy for the state to just collect, another lump sum and throw it in the treasury, we're really destroying the integrity of the potential of this industry going forward. So the idea is, let's give it a couple years. Let's let the dust settle. Let's see where the need is. Let's see what the demand is like in the market. And then we can issue more licenses. I think it's fair and it's responsible. Sorry, didn't mean to interject.
No. And I think that's a good point, though. You look at the surrounding states, you look at Massachusetts specifically, who's got over 100 dispensaries recreational, and it has caused a massive outflux of Rhode Island cannabis users to go over state lines. And they're becoming, I think through the pandemic, it became even more apparent. And that started to shrink the cannabis market in Rhode Island. So already they're dealing with all of these problems being sort of federally illegal. But now their market's going away. And it's going to a state that has sort of engaged the recreational use of cannabis and done it responsibly and done it pretty well, besides their testing regulations. But our market here in Rhode Island is going to collapse upon itself, I think, if we don't pass something to get recreational use in Rhode Island very quickly.
That's where we're at right now, and I actually just pulled it up. We're taping today on Wednesday, May 18th, and at 3:30 today, is that correct? Let me see. 3:30 today, they're going to be voting inside the House Finance Committee on the bills to legalize recreational cannabis. So, all indicators are that it's going to make it out of those committees and that we're going to be looking at legalized recreational cannabis here in Rhode Island pretty soon. Maybe, like we said, by June, the legislation will have passed and dispensaries could be open before the end of this year. So very interesting stuff there. But today, focusing on the history of cannabis in a medical context, really interesting conversation. I would say that, anybody out there who has any confusion about cannabis, the legitimacy of cannabis in a medical context, people say, you're just using the card to get stoned or whatever it is, that type of context, pass this episode on to them and put it on the car when you're going to work and take a look through the history, because this is it's pretty clear as day. It's pretty much clear as day when you look back through history. It's a modern, in the grand scope of history, it's a very modern and short period of time that cannabis.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.